Good afternoon. For those of you who haven't met, my name is Caroline Wilkie and I'm the CEO of the Australasian Railway Association. It's my absolute pleasure to host this panel here today and this forum to discuss innovation and technology in the rail sector. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which we meet. For me, it's the Ngunnawal people here in Canberra, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to recognise the Indigenous peoples on the lands upon which you join us today. I'd also like to send heartfelt thoughts to those of you joining us from Melbourne. 2020 certainly hasn't turned out how we thought it would, and I know for our country you've had to bear the brunt of that, and for that we are forever grateful, and hopefully we will see you very soon. But just to let you know that we're thinking of you today. I'm really delighted to be able to be here today to launch our new research project, Fast Tracking Rail Innovation. We're very fortunate to be able to have LEK develop this research and present for us here today, which is wonderful. Recently, the ARA conducted a member survey, and thank you to those of you on the line who participated in that. As part of the survey, we asked our membership what the big issues for them were in the sector, and technology and innovation came through time and time again. In terms of the one-on-one meetings I've also had with members, technology has also been front and centre. So we certainly got it right with our first major research paper to share with you today. We have a number of major research papers that will be launched over coming weeks. The next one will be The Value of Rail by Deloitte. We also have major freight and supply chain papers to be launched around Ausrail. In terms of this report today, comes at a time where our industry is at a crossroads. We're expecting 155 billion of rail investment over the next 15 years, which is a huge opportunity for both the economy, community, and for our industry in particular. But we will need new technology and innovation to really make the most of the investment and ensure our network of the future is as modern, responsive, and competitive as possible. Today's report gives us a clear pathway for improving technology and innovation adoption in the rail sector. And the delivery of this report is just the beginning. The ARA will be pursuing an extensive advocacy program to support this work, as well as partnering with key stakeholders, including ACRI and RISB, to look at what opportunities we have to work together to further the industry in this area. Today is very much the first step, and I look forward to keeping you informed of our progress. We have a packed agenda for you today, so let's get the conversation started. First, the report authors from L.E.K Consulting will provide us an overview of the report's key findings. After that, we have an impressive panel of industry leaders joining me for a Q&A session to see what the report tells us about experiences on the ground and how we can bring opportunities to life into the future. If you would like to submit a question at any time, please go to the control panel to the right of your screen and enter your questions there. I will receive them directly here. We'll get through as many of those as we possibly can today. So on to the report's key findings. I'm pleased to introduce Natasha Santha and Janice Lee from L.E.K Consulting to provide an overview of the report released today. Natasha is a partner at L.E.K and is part of the company's transport, new mobility and infrastructure practices. She's worked across a range of wide areas within the transport and infrastructure sector and regularly advises governments and infrastructure owners on the impacts of new or emerging technologies to their organisations. Natasha has also worked extensively across the energy value chain and has a deep understanding of the implications of decarbonising transport. Janice leads L.E.K's government practice in Australia and brings more than 17 years of experience advising governments on economic, infrastructure and social policy. Her work on the implications of technology and new service models for infrastructure planning has spanned transport, health, education, energy and the justice sector. It's fantastic to have both Natasha and Janice join us today to share their insights on the report's key findings. Please welcome them both. Thanks, Natasha and Janice.
Thanks so much, Caroline, for those very kind words in your introduction. So I might just get you to go to the next slide, Cindy. So this study focuses on the case for investment in technology development and innovation in the rail industry, and importantly, how to support Australia to become a leading innovator and adopter of technology and smart solutions. So to do this, we set about undertaking a multi-pronged research and stakeholder consultation and analytical work program over June to August earlier this year. We've interviewed over 20 organisations, and you can see some of the logos there on the screen across the rail ecosystem, including ARA members, as well as undertaking consultation with industry advisory groups. We also undertook research and analysis of available public reports across a number of key jurisdictions for comparison, reviewed patents databases as well, just to get a better understanding of the quantum of innovation that we're seeing across the industry. Just onto the next slide. So we took a broad view of rail technology as depicted by this infographic that you can see on your screen there. And this is just especially an acknowledgement of the fact that rail innovation, it spans operations, the customer interface, network infrastructure, as well as safety, signalling and traction technology. And so when you do get a chance to read the report, you'll see that we haven't focused narrowly in on one thing, but rather thought of rail technology quite broadly. And on to the next slide. So as we looked across the sector and the prevailing economic climate right now and the forward-looking pipeline, it was very clear to us that there is a significant opportunity for getting innovation right. And this slide depicts some of the key facts that support this argument. I mean, the first here is that the global market for rail technology is huge. It's estimated to be worth over $360 billion. And it's a growing market. And it's one that's in the midst of digital and technology disruption. There's a convergence of information and communication technologies, which have changed the way that railways are planned, built, run and maintained. But we're also seeing innovation from other sectors, such as energy and manufacturing and defence, that are also transferable into rail. And this goes both ways, where tech developed into rail could also be exported to other sectors. And Caroline mentioned this, in her intro, that Australia is due to spend over $150 billion on rail construction over the next 15 years. And this really puts us at a crossroads at the moment, and it's a once in a generation opportunity to collaborate and innovate across the states and territories, with the potential for direct applications into our Australian construction projects today. So the decisions that we make now collectively as an industry can maximise the innovation opportunities across this program of work. And now onto COVID. I mean, whilst this has caused havoc, especially on our passenger rail networks, it is driving a review of local supply chain strategies across multiple industries, including rail. And it's also been a catalyst for innovation. The classic example, Sydney Trains, displaying real-time carriage occupancy rates on platform screens by weighing carriages, for example. But it's also increased the rail industry's focus on being more self-reliant for time-critical supplies, and prompting governments to rethink measures for supporting sovereign manufacturing capability, especially for strategic and high-value products. And despite sort of a typically higher upfront cost for innovation, we have seen multiple examples around the world of how innovation can deliver real benefits, especially when you're thinking about a whole of life cost perspective. So we see whole of life cost savings, capacity improvements, reliability improvements, time savings, as well as enhanced safety and energy efficiency outcomes. In addition to this, our unique environment presents a number of opportunities to spur innovation. So the Australian railway industry in the past has developed many innovative solutions, especially in response to some of our unique challenges that we face, so high temperatures and expansive low-density rail networks. And we often forget that Australia has pockets of global best-in-class innovation, and we need to do more to promote our innovation locally and abroad. So, for example, we have one of the most advanced heavy haul railway operations in the Pilbara region, And then also the Monash Institute of Rail Technology is considered a world leader in condition monitoring. And that's been exported and implemented by the Hong Kong Metro. And last but not least, the rail industry could benefit from policy objectives to be carbon neutral by 2050. And arguably, it is easy to decarbonise the rail fleet, especially fleet operations that are on electric traction technology. And rail also has the potential to be a key mode to decongest some of our busiest cities. On to the next slide, please. So what we found in the study was that there is this virtual cycle across the innovation chain. So new rail technology requires collaboration to reduce the hurdles between each stage of the value chain, from research and development to commercialization to manufacturing to final deployment with rail managers and operators. And what we found was that the countries with the strongest rail innovation systems across a whole, as depicted by the graphic that's on the screen at the moment, tended to have the most innovative rail networks. So we start on the right-hand side. Rail managers and operators want access to local manufacturing because they prefer to buy locally, as it reduces wait times for equipment and makes servicing and maintenance easier. And then conversely, a steady pipeline of investment by rail managers and operators sustains local manufacturing capability and its supply chain. Local manufacturers also benefit from the commercialisation of local research. A major economic benefit of advanced manufacturing is the feeder system of local R&D and related supply chain, which in turn creates more opportunities for local manufacturers as those subsectors develop. And then lastly, researchers benefit when rail operators need new solutions and actively fund that research. On to the next slide. However, and there is always a but, there are a number of barriers. So as I mentioned up front, we undertook a lot of interviews, and this slide just depicts some of the consistent themes that came up in our interviews with stakeholders when we asked them about what are the barriers to innovation. The first theme is around Australia's stop-start R&D funding mindset that's not fully aligned to industry needs. So government support for commercialisation has historically tended to be on a periodic or program basis. So with the last CRC finished in June 2020 and no future plans for federally funded rail R&D type institute to replace it, this was a fairly big concern from the participants that we interviewed. Participants indicated that they believed this lack of continuity in rail research has broken the momentum and the R&D culture that the RMCRCs had begun to build within the industry. And, there were mixed views about the relative success of the rail CRCs, but however, smaller suppliers in particular noted the importance of a centre that could connect researchers and small innovative companies with larger suppliers and project funders. Regardless, the finite tenure of the CRCs and continuous sort of change in the approach and collaboration models have appeared to have caused uncertainty. Secondly, the second box at the top, industry participants also advocated for measures to bridge the gap in the innovation ecosystem, especially between R&D and commercialisation. Effectively, this just means finding a better match for technology that is developed by innovators and then connecting them to the end users. And by doing so, this provides a greater likelihood of embedding technology that is developed. The next point on the top right-hand corner is that state government procurement policies often stipulate a minimum level of local state-based content required within rail projects. And participants believe that this has inhibited manufacturing scale. So whilst there is a great intention in having local content requirements, participants believe that this has led to the establishment of small-scale duplicated facilities for some products and platforms across multiple sites in Australia rather than building a scaled, specialised manufacturing facility. Stakeholders also talked about a risk aversion culture within Australia's passenger rail sector, and that this was a barrier to adopting new technologies. They talked about public sector rail operators requiring an extremely high evidence base that demonstrates in-service product performance, which is harder to do when you've got new technology. They also stated a political risk for the late delivery of projects and pressure of personal attribution in the event that an accident occurs. Conversely, the private sector approach to evaluating risk return for new investment was held up as it was best practice and a key enabler of technology adoption. And when speaking to Australia's private sector rail owners and operators, it was clear that they saw financial benefits in managing technology adoption risks rather than choosing to eliminate all risk by not adopting new technologies. And lastly, industry consultation also highlighted the role of public sector procurement and contracting in enabling technology adoption and promoting supplier-led innovation. And there was certainly a call for greater levels of innovation-based KPIs, as well as adjusting procurement terms so that we're not automatically asking for like technology replacement in new procurements. Just on to the next slide. So these barriers are further compounded by the fact that the Australian market is highly fragmented. And this makes the market really challenging for technology suppliers. And this slide just depicts some of the actors in the rail industry. And there are multiple state and territory rules and standards, state-based, local content procurement preferences, as well as multiple rail owners and operators. And this high degree of fragmentation creates a structural barrier to the efficient take-up and procurement of new technologies. The consultations were universally, they identify the challenges of working across 8 jurisdictions in Australia. We're already a small country, and this level of fragmentation just makes us even smaller. And the impact of this is a fractured buying market for new technology, ultimately requiring multiple paths to market for the same products. And individual rail operators don't really benefit from scale efficiencies. Likewise, a supplier might have, high costs for reaching individual buyers with small orders, and then each of them then needs to be modified. I'll just hand over to Janice.
Thank you. Could we please flick to the next slide? So before jumping into recommendations, probably worth just stepping through a few of the points of finding in the benchmarking that we did. It's not in any way exhaustive, so it's really just to capture a few of the points where we felt the learnings from overseas could inform the response that we have here in Australia. This first slide really makes a point quite distinct from what Natasha was just talking about. There is this constant feedback about Australia being a small market, a small population, and highly fragmented within that. So it suffers from a scale issue. Nonetheless, when you actually look at the statistics of Australia's rail system, we're not a small network. Compared to some of these significant comparator jurisdictions, we have a lot of rail infrastructure. We have a big network, and we spend a lot to run and maintain that. And so it's quite an important point to reframe some of this discussion. Next slide, please, Cindy. When you look at a number of the step change in rail technologies, and bear in mind, we weren't able to do this exhaustively, so we selected a few that we thought could be indicative of how Australia tended to perform in terms of its adoption. What was notable about them was that Australia really did show pockets of world-leading innovation in the development of technology that could be used on rail. But despite that, the Australian railways tend to lag in their adoption and use of those technologies. So in terms of the development, as Natasha mentioned, we have the auto haul in the Pilbara region. We have the development of condition monitoring technology, the development by the ARTC of alternative signalling systems. We have quite a few areas of leading innovation, but the take-up of some of these new technologies is slow. And one of the main findings we had when we dug into some of this was that in all of these, national governments and regional governments have a very strong role to play. So in terms of positive train control, you see a very strong role for regulatory mandate, for regional directives. In relation to high-speed rail, just the costs of it have meant you've seen quite a lot of national or centralised priority setting and targets in order to grow high-speed rail networks. So certainly a key finding here was the role of national priorities. Next slide, please. So we looked at some of the challenges that Australian railways do face, and certainly this came out in many of our interviews. Railway operators and suppliers talked about a scarcity mindset, which is, you know, when it comes to implementing new technology systems, retrofitting them onto existing networks, it's too expensive, it's too hard, it's very difficult. And as a result, you tended to see technology upgrades having to wait for major project investment. Really what we felt that this chart showed was the need to potentially flip that, that the experience in Australia and the experience elsewhere is that the use of innovation and the use of technology on railways makes them more cost efficient and more productive. And certainly we felt there was a need to sort of turn that scarcity mindset on its head a little bit. Next slide, please. So it was quite difficult to look at holistically at the innovation systems in each of these countries. We took as one indicator the level and the way in which national R&D to commercialisation funding is provided. And there are some exemplars in that regard. Two things really stood out when we looked at this, and that graph shows the level of public funding that these institutions had, but also the level of private funding that they were able to unlock or corral. And in this case, the two things that struck us were the importance of longevity, so of sustained public funding to provide certainty for players, and the importance of that funding being used to unlock collaboration. So what we saw in these good practices in Australia and abroad has been that funding, that public funding, had fostered collaboration, connected big players to small players, connected research to buyers and users. So it tended to support a system across these coordination constraints, so across the innovation life cycle, across sectors, and unlock private contribution as well. And that is quite important. If you look at, say, the UK example of Ukraine, one of the services they do is around routes to market. So really allowing for new technologies to be tested and setting up a path by which they can get regulatory approval. Next slide, please. And this is a narrower point, but not likewise important. Referring back to the slide Natasha showed around the virtuous circle, manufacturing, and there's a lot of discussion about advanced manufacturing in Australia at the moment. Manufacturing is both the product of upstream and downstream activity, and that became very clear in our discussions with Australian operators and also in our research abroad. The Australian manufacturing sector is forecast to return to modest growth in the next few years, spurred very largely by what is a once-in-a-generation pipeline. I think if you look at the UK, we can see that significant development in the industry settings and the innovation settings of that sector, and also in major projects, is also leading to an increase in their manufacturing revenue forecast. So that's a really important point, just to show some of the linkages between these sections of effort. If we go to the next slide, it leads us to the recommendations we made in the study, which is just to reflect on the importance of culture, the importance of national leadership, the importance of collaboration and coordination across a pipeline of investment. So the three objectives we set was that Australia really should, if it is important to achieve these sorts of efficiencies and to improve the rail sector in Australia, should make rail innovation a national priority. And that would involve the establishment of a new national public body, which would fill the vacuum that's been left by the closure of the CRC. That body would have the ability to drive and promote interoperability across Australia's emerging pipeline of projects, but it would also be able to bring to that work the best from other fields, so from telco, from defence, from mining and energy. The second recommendation there is for that body to be able to drive an investment program to both initiate R&D and to commercialise it, and to help with bridging where that they're bridging those failures between sections of the life cycle. The third is to develop a national rail innovation and capability strategy. And the intention for that is that it's linked very much to some of the other measures we've got in there, but really around building capability that is linked to the digital smart rail investments pipeline, and having strong links to the National Rail Action Plan also. The fourth recommendation is to continue to develop an export strategy for Australian rail innovation, and that's really the purview of a national body. The second objective is to build a single market for rail technology, and I think this is something that is often spoken about in transport reform, and which becomes much more pressing in the context of rapid technological development. So in the case of rail, recognising that we do have a federal system and that it is that way for certain reasons, nonetheless, the importance of developing common standards that are linked to nationally accredited testing. This would, where it can be done, would drive a much more certain pathway for innovators. Recommendation 6 is around advocating and reviewing the impacts of state local content policies, and potentially where we can, replacing it with a national policy instead. We came across suppliers who were able to show us the impacts of some of these policies, where they had to duplicate facilities, and it really prevented the achievement of efficient scales. So that's quite an important one. Recommendation 7 is around developing industry standardised training for new rail systems. Taking an industry level view of skills development. The third objective was to build a culture for rail innovation. And this is quite an ambitious one, but it has 3 areas of focus. Recommendation 8 is around focusing on best practice procurement and contracting. And that's potentially coordinating public sector agencies, looking at ways by which contracts can improve innovation adoption through targets and incentives, and removing terms that discourage the development of innovation. Recommendation 9 is around developing state smart rail strategies to build the planning pipeline for digital technology. And this really goes to the fact that traditional planning, rail planning, has really been skewed towards engineering-dominated focuses on physical infrastructure as the means of achieving rail improvement, rail capacity, safety, and productivity. And this would feed into the work that the new national public body would do, which is recognising that states really still run and develop the pipeline of investments in Australia largely, that actually planning out for the development of smart rail strategies at state level would really begin to grow transparency and a robustness in the pipeline for new technology. And lastly, building the brand for Australian rail innovators, global trade shows. We recognise that this work is being done already, but really bringing a number of these strands together makes for a cogent national agenda and would really empower some of the efforts that are already being done. It would allow for Australia to broadcast and capture past successes and cultivate opportunities for emerging innovators as well. Caroline.
Hello, sorry for the delay there. Technology, we aim for the best intentions, but it sometimes gets us. Thank you so much, Natasha and Janice, for that presentation. It was fantastic. Any closing thoughts? Obviously, you've presented on what we have in terms of the research, but anything that stood out for you as part of this process and engaging with industry?
Oh, you're on mute, Natasha.
Can you hear me now?
Janice, do you want to? Yeah.
Sorry.
You go first.
I mean, a couple of things for me. First, it was just there was so much consistency across the industry stakeholder consultations. Usually you get quite a bit of variation, but when we talked about some of the barriers that the industry faces, the themes were just so consistent across the interviews that I think we can quite confidently say we know what we're trying to solve for. And probably another reflection that I have is that there is just so much opportunity out there if we can get this right. You just stare down the pipeline of construction that's happening, and we have such an opportunity that if we are able to coordinate across the various states and territories and take that sort of national approach, the opportunities really is huge for Australia as a whole, and it benefits the rail industry, but broader than that as well.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, I absolutely agree. We were really struck by the passion that came out from all the interviews that we did, and many of the themes were very similar, were very consistent, not just amongst suppliers, say, but across the board with operators as well. So I think there is a great deal of consensus actually in this, and we were quite pleased that this report could really bring that to life. I think the other thing that really struck us was just the historical analogy of what happened with rail development in Australia at the very outset of a federation, and trying to make sure that we don't continue and embed those problems moving forward. That really the objective here is to have a national market, to use the scale that we have as best as we can, and to promote collaboration so that we don't find downstream there are just these significant interoperability issues between systems, as individual trains are navigating different networks across Australia.
One other question, just to throw you a curly one. Obviously, you looked at a number of international markets to do the comparison pieces for this piece of work. Were there any markets that stood out to you that had similarities that we should particularly look to?
I think we probably found the UK seemed that it was a step or two ahead of us, and that it was the most relatable immediately in terms of the institutions that it had. So the report does refer quite a bit to a number of initiatives there. So both UCRIN, which was established in 2018, and the rail sector deal, which is really about an industry policy that brings together innovation and rail providers. And I think that does certainly give us some lessons that we can look at here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I could just add to that, I feel like any jurisdiction you pick is not quite exactly comparable to Australia, but there are just so many principles that you want to see if you can bring across and establish here. Like, one of the things that really stood out to me, especially in Japan and also in the UK, is just the ability to take an innovative idea from the start and then link it through to a project downstream, so that the innovation has somewhere to go and then can be embedded, which I think is really important for us given where we are right now in terms of our investment pipeline.
Certainly the joy of federation comes out time and time again as one of those issues. Our chairman, Danny, tells a great story about one of our members who said that he had to explain to head office in Europe that he was actually working in 6 or 8 countries in Australia rather than one, in terms of the work that he was doing. And I think sometimes people can certainly feel that way. So any final comments before we move to the panel?
None for me.
None for you, Janice. Anything else from you, Natasha?
No, just really excited to hopefully see that some of the recommendations in this paper get taken forward, and that for the 200 or 300 people that are on this call listening, like, I think there are low-hanging pieces of fruit that we can start getting moving on, from simple things to just changing the mindset to innovation, and thinking about how we can encourage procurement of innovation through our supply chains.
Wonderful. And thank you to LEK so much for undertaking this piece of work. We were very fortunate to have you to do it. So thank you. So thank you very much for the presentation. We might now move to our panel discussion. We've been privileged to bring together some very high profile industry leaders on this issue to join us today. They're joining us now. Firstly, we're joined by the Chief Executive of VicTrack, Cam Rose. Cam has led VicTrack since 2013 after an extensive career spanning infrastructure, development and construction, and also elite sport. He was admitted as a member of the Order of Australia in 2017 for his civic contribution to Melbourne events and the transport sector. We're also joined by Michael McLellan, who's been the Managing Director of Knorr Bremse Australia since 2004. Michael served as a Director of the Rail Manufacturing Cooperative Research Centre from 2016 to 2020 and has been an ARA Director since 2018. I'm also pleased to welcome Dale Coleman. Dale is one of those members when I called him up originally who had a lot to say about technology, so I'm really pleased he's able to join us today. He's the CEO and founder of TTG Transportation Technology, which delivers energy optimization systems for railway operations internationally. He's a past president of the Railtrack Association of Australia and a former board member of the Australian Rail Industry Corporation. He's part of the ARA's Rail Industry Group and chairs our Technology Working Group. We're also joined by Rob Moffat, who commenced his role as CEO of the Australasian Centre for Rail Innovation in July. Originally from Scotland, Rob has spent 2 decades within the Australian rail industry, working for both private and public sector organisations. We're also welcoming back Janice for the panel session. So before we begin, 2 things. One is a reminder to post any questions in the chat section of your control panel. The second thing is I'm going to deal with the elephant in the room before we get started. No, we are not trying to abolish ACRI. Yes, we think ACRI has a very important role to play in this discussion, and keen to hear more from Rob about that. So I think Rob's going to be the lucky first one to start us off. In the thick of things when it comes to rail innovation in Australia and New Zealand, that's your role, Rob. You've only recently started in the role. What is your experience of the industry's approach to research to innovation, and are we doing enough?
Excellent. Thanks, Caroline. Hello, everybody. Like to start off by, I guess, acknowledging the LEK report. I think it's excellent evidence that will be thought-provoking for the industry, and let's see whether we can take this opportunity to move the debate forward after today. So thanks, Janice and team. Great work. But another thing to say is, I don't know, do we have subtitles available? And does anybody need to switch on their subtitles function to catch what I'm saying? I'll try to make sure I use my 2 decades of experience in Australia to speak properly and to try to pronounce as many syllables as I possibly can. So bear with me. So the Australasian Centre for Rail Innovation, it's an interesting model that before taking up the role, I wasn't too aware of. So let me just draw together a couple of dot points that may be of interest. It's industry led and industry governed. It's funded by both private and public sector rail entities. It really focuses on commercially relevant research, not blue sky. It looks to share the costs of research and to share challenges. And interestingly, it has been carried forward at the industry's own initiative. It's from the original CRC for rail innovation that we know was seed funded by government. It has very, very skinny overheads in terms of numbers, not just physique. And it's been sustained through 2 tranches. So it's 6 years old and it's heading into its 3rd tranche. The challenge, though, is although the team and my predecessors have done a great job, we've delivered essentially across that 6 years around $10 million worth of research in the pursuit of innovation, again, through industry funding. Now, if I look at what you started with, Caroline, the 155 billion of rail investment in the next 15 years, I think we're something like 10 orders of magnitude below what that figure is. So clearly the opportunity to invest more, given the portfolio of work that's up ahead, is there. Now, one of the things in terms of problems is that clearly in a model such as the one that I'm now looking after, those that pay for the innovation and research, they're not naturally looking to share the output of work that they've paid for by themselves. Now, this isn't just something that's unique to ACRI. This is the same for any private industry organisation that pursues work on their own behalf, or indeed a university. Now, how do you solve that? Well, a greater degree of collaboration and funding would certainly be part of the solution. And to that end, the report does promote a greater role for the Commonwealth Government from a funding perspective. And I certainly have empathy for that conclusion. In terms of, rounding out on your, are we doing enough? Well, I think when we start hearing people say that the biggest problem facing the Australian rail industry is that it's too innovative, then we know we've probably pushed the boundary to where I'd like to see it going.
Wonderful. Janice, Rob has outlined some of the challenges but also some of the opportunities. During your report, you uncovered some successful models overseas, including what you already mentioned around the UK and the Defence Innovation Hub. What do you think has led to their success, and how can we draw from that directly here in Australia?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think in all of the cases that we looked at, to varying levels of success, they were essentially collaboration models. And that involved a number of different parts. It's advocacy, it's bridging services, and it's providing those links across sectors and across industry, and it's capability mapping and development over time. And I do believe that there are some very good lessons for that. I mean, and Australia's done that too. Australia understands it. The Defence Innovation Hub is one example of that. The CRC's tried different models along the way, but essentially were in that space of trying to connect research to users and to purchasers. So those connections are important for innovation and for managing what otherwise can be market failures, I suppose. In the case of UK, which I mentioned before, the accelerator they had attracted quite a lot of industry funding, which is for the public funding that was seeded there. And it really brought together a network of universities, of industry partners, large and small. And it had a twofold objective, which is really to deploy new technology, but also to actually drive rail productivity by accelerating uptake of technology. And I think those two together are very significant. You know, and actually the means of how that is done doesn't need to be singular either. And you know, there's sort of, you can look at a raft of things across the countries that we studied, which is sort of covered in the report, such as, you know, innovation competitions, initiatives to improve innovation procurement, testing facilities, route to market activities. So actually there's a lot that you can do, but it needs to have a focus. It needs to have an owner. It needs to have a champion to be able to do that.
Wonderful. Dale, those models that we're talking about really do highlight the importance of partnership between the public and private sectors. As a private sector business, what has your experience been, and why do you think we haven't seen that level of engagement in the past?
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. Good afternoon, folks. Before I start, I'm in Sydney. Just also want to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Gadigal people, land on which we are. Also, before we get to the get-go, it's black and gold here in Sydney, so go the Tigers and go the Panthers on the weekend for the football. I haven't alienated half the audience here, but that's coming up. Also, Caroline, to acknowledge the ARA, it's a fantastic initiative, and folks who did the LEK, I think it's a really good report, and it's absolutely, I think, nailing a lot of the issues that those of us in the industry that are involved in innovation kind of get. You mentioned the UK, and I spent half my life in the UK, at least I used to before we got grounded. Birmingham University, who have kind of led on the UK rail research, there are a number of institutions there. Just to put that in perspective, they have a budget of £35 million, employ 70 plus researchers just in rail. The UK rail industry have £300 million. If you take Network Rail and the various government initiatives, there's a £300 million rail research fund. So that's it right there. It's the level of funding, the level of available commitment to research. Contrast that here, we're way off. So you talk about engagement. Engagement will go up if people respond to the needs. If we identify the needs and create the opportunity to respond to those needs, then research will go up. It's kind of almost that simple. We need to respond to the needs. Australia has moved from a make to a take environment, and we need to get back to a make thought process. So they're the kind of the key issues. And if I might say, we need to get a pitch around this. We need to have, this is about a selling job. So the pitch that I've got in my mind is smart rail for a sustainable Australia. If you think about that, everything fits under that kind of heading. And to the point about COVID, I think it's an absolutely valid point and a great opportunity for change. If you add smart rail for a safe and sustainable Australia, I think you encapsulate just in one line what we want to try and build when we talk about an innovative country.
Cam, the report highlights an unwillingness for people to try new things, basically, and I know that there are a lot of reasons for that. VicTrack is currently implementing a major transformation project to facilitate the rollout of high-capacity signalling technology. So you obviously see the value of adopting new approaches, and you and I have spoken, and I know you're all into all of the great, exciting technological opportunities that VicTrack can look into. As someone who is investing in technology, do you see risks if we're not among the first to adopt the new innovations? And can you share with us some of your reflections of your experience at VicTrack?
Great. Yeah, well, welcome everybody, and hello, and thanks, Caroline. And look, I'd like to just commence by endorsing the comments of the previous Dale and Robert. An excellent report. Well done to Natasha and Janice in your presentation. And I'd like to say probably at the onset, we've spent a fair bit of time, and well done on this report led by the ARA on the what, the why. There's a very sound rationale for change here. Dale's articulated a very clear case for additional funding, clear strategy underpinned by good research. It's now a matter of how we get on with it. How do we find the how? And we bring about the change that's needed. And in my view, despite what I'm about to comment on in terms of your direct question, COVID-19 is forcing the need for change on us more so than ever, that we probably would have never expected before, certainly in my life, that I could have ever envisaged. So I think the opportunity is now for us to get on with the how. To that end, look, I think there are a number of issues in either being the first adopter or not being the first adopter. You can be a follower, you can be a leader, or you can be a bleeder at the bleeding edge. Or what I'd like to see Australia, and I think the Innovation Australia, to be either a leader or very, very close behind the leader. Dale made a comment, a make or take environment. You only had to listen to the federal government budget and the intention for Australia to no longer be so dependent upon overseas manufacturing, given the importance, the size and the scale of our country, albeit it may not have the population. There is a demand or a need for us to underpin local manufacturing, which is spurred by innovation, of which Australia used to be more than a leader. It actually used to be some of the best innovators in the world. To put in context some of the things that VicTrack is doing, we've chosen to invest some $70 million in our TTI, trunk telecommunications infrastructure, effectively the telecommunications network that underpins not only the signalling system, but the radio telecommunications that supports the communication between trains, drivers of trains, Central, Metro, and the other related systems that underpin the safety and the efficiency of our system. Some key issues that I think we face, not being an early adopter or things that prevent it, risk, and always the issue of, well, what risks are we prepared to take? Risk in this country is not rewarded. In other countries, when you fail fast, you get up and you go again. And that is not necessarily the case in this country. I think another one, certainly from a government point of view, is procurement. Procurement is the killer in government environments for innovation. And there are boundaries which we all understand and we must adhere to, and we must prevent inappropriate behaviours that drive inappropriate procurement. But procurement, if we don't have, and I think it was reported in the LEK report, smart procurement, then it becomes difficult to be a new adopter of technologies or even the developer of new technologies.
Absolutely. One area where we have seen quite a lot of innovation is in the heavy haul sector, Janice. Do you want to reflect on, what could we learn from the mining industry as a whole in this space, and how can other rail operators benefit from that experience?
Yeah. When we interviewed the heavy haulers, they were very clear about the efficiency incentive for them to adopt new technology and to develop new technology. And in some ways, they have a simpler operating environment, I guess, to passenger rail planners who have to navigate, their own strategic planning process, their own investment decision-making process, etc. The heavy haulers were very clear about the fact that they could get internal support for new technology development when it made business sense for them to do so. And that rational approach to planning is really captured in some of our recommendations around taking a lifetime view of the costs of technology development and the technology adoption in rail. It clearly is an issue that the price tag of some of these systems is a barrier at the front end, but certainly not when you look at it over the lifetime of that technology. I guess the other lesson out of it was, to our surprise, on the development of the heavy haul, that they really talked about a sort of can-do attitude in terms of working with regulators to make that happen. And I do think there's a really good set of learnings in there for the rail sector, which tends to be quite risk averse in Australia.
Michael, welcome. Thank you for joining us. One of the drivers for the resources sector has been the need to compete quite fiercely in the international market. Knorr Bremse has 28,000 people working across 30 countries. So you're very much part of the global economy. Do you think that access to a wider network helps drive increased investment in technology?
Thanks, Caroline. I might just, before I answer that, I might just talk a bit about what Janice says as well. Our experience with the miners was they were absolutely laser focused on getting longer, faster, heavier trains, and it was very clear what their problem was, and that they were going to spend some money to do it, to fix it. They collaborated and engaged with the supply chain very strongly. So I think that's one of the reasons, or one of the lessons I think we could learn in the passenger rail. I understand the passenger rail is more complex for sure. But coming back to your question, Caroline, I think as a multinational like Knorr Bremse, we have centres of excellence all over the world. So there needs to be some reason to locally spend on R&D, say in Australia. These reasons often relate to existing expertise in the country, whether that be internally within our company or within the universities or research institutions. Then it often needs to be good particular local problems or applications that need to be solved. And generally you need a welcoming environment of innovation from local industry and from government in general. But I think there is a payoff for engaging multinationals in R&D in Australia, and that is we have access to global supply chains, and that can create export opportunities. And I think that came out in the report too, Janice. Just to use my own company as an example, for instance, in Australia, in Sydney, we have a centre of competency for HVAC. So we do a lot of research and development for Australia, but also for other parts of the world. And that leads to export opportunities for us, for instance. So right now at the back, just near my office here, we are currently building HVAC units or air conditioning units for trains that we're exporting to Dhaka in Bangladesh. We have contracts for projects into Doha, Chicago, Miami, Hong Kong, and a number of other international cities. So we've become somewhat of an expert in high temperature, high humidity conditions for railway. And we've developed that expertise and that centre of competency here, and we have the ability to do research and development accordingly. So we don't necessarily manufacture everything here, but we certainly hold contracts in a lot of export places. We invoice out of Australia, we pay taxes in Australia. So there is a downstream advantage in export manufacturing, or at least engineering, if you can establish good R&D within country. So I guess the lesson is multinationals will respond given the right conditions, and the LEK report talked a lot about the right conditions that need to be set up to attract R&D investment. And I think additionally, multinationals are good partners for local SMEs as well, and can help leverage them into international markets.
Absolutely, and that's certainly what we hear from a number of our members in terms of their experience. Dale, you've got a really strong international focus. I know it must be quite interesting for you being so homebound the last 9 months. What has your experience been about international attitudes to the adoption of technology in the rail sector?
Well, you know what? I think we'd like to have a much stronger local focus in a way, but we're in the international market for all sorts of reasons. It's a bigger market. So what's clear to me, and we're probably mostly focused in the UK and Europe, but I've operated around the world. But let's say it's clear that in Europe there are three real drivers for the industry. It's about automation. So that's not just in rail, but it's everywhere. People are looking for automation, real time, 24/7. Better outcomes, more reliable outcomes. Digitization, so the connected world, moving to more real-time systems, so things are done in real time. That's a huge driver, for change, for innovation and technology. The third one's energy, whether that's about straight cost reduction, but it's also about climate. There's been a big shift in the last 18 months, certainly in Europe, for the community demanding change. Rail is the sustainable transport mode, so it follows that it has a big role to play in a shift to rail through that energy efficiency. Happens to be the space we work in, but it's nevertheless a big driver. What we see in Europe and certainly in the UK, I think to a lesser extent, but in Europe, there are clear targets. There are the European Union, UIC, country by country, they have set themselves absolute targets to drive change, and they're getting on with it. So they've got clear objectives. And that's a kind of a fundamental. There's a much higher level of investment. The scales are significant. The investment in rail, in research and innovation is in the hundreds of millions of euros or more. So the numbers are there. People are investing. There are specifications and standards that are being written for the future technology. So there's already the landscape in which start to create this innovative technology because someone has thought through the standards around which this technology has to fit. In Europe, they've got a unified standard that's being rolled out across Europe called SFERA. It's to have a common exchange across Europe. So people have thought about that. Then to the point about procurement, if you don't specify it in some process to buy it, then it ain't going to be happening. So the procurement model is critical. You have to specify these things. That's a fundamental point. And then I guess the final point which I mentioned is the demand from society, demanding change, expecting people to change is going to drive innovation. So they're the things that I think are very clear in the UK and Europe, and we absolutely need to learn the lesson here, on that. But the roadmap is there for us, and we want to follow it.
Michael, in terms of moving forward, there's obviously a major focus on stimulus measures, and just even from discussions I've been having with people in ministerial offices and departments, there's very much a focus on what are the low-hanging fruit, what is it that we can do now to help industry. So in terms with that in mind, I mean, how do you think we should be changing our approach to innovation in the rail sector?
I think, look, all credit to state and federal governments for the enormous tranche of spending that's coming up over the next few years. A lot of this spending is targeted at to stimulate economic growth because of COVID and the like. But I think just more spending helps because the supply chain tends to be a little better off. So when we're doing the rail CRC, we definitely notice when business is good, companies are more likely to spend money. So I think that environment helps. But just doing more of the same or just doing more projects with 10 or 15-year-old technology is not going to help. We're going to have to change the way we do things. So things like standardising, aggregating the market, creating clear priorities and commercial incentives, and some national leadership. I mean, we need to be able to see. Private companies need to be able to see that there's some sort of pot of gold at the end of their investment. So if we can create an environment where we can see that, yes, these sorts of technologies are going to be implemented, then private companies like ours will invest, and they will invest locally as well. But you need somewhat of a roadmap, and you need some certainty, not certainty, but at least some degree of certainty around technology adoption. Yeah.
So I have a question, just a more open question to all of you, which wasn't planned, but I will put it out there. Obviously, this report has a number of recommendations, but I wouldn't mind just reflecting at this point from all of you about what do you think we need to do to drive more innovation? And I'll start with Robert.
I think it seems almost too simple to say money, but I think we've got some good track records and various guises from the CRCs, from the work that ACRI's done, from the work that industry's done by itself, but we're just not spending a big enough proportion of our budgets in the pursuit of innovation, Caroline. I think it sounds a little bit simple, but it's certainly an important ingredient for that success.
Cam, over to you. What are your thoughts?
this somewhat goes to probably one of the questions you're going to ask me. I think there's a window of opportunity in front of us that times have changed. Our world, Australia, but the rest of the world's changed. COVID-19 is absolutely changing everything in front of us. Look at this type of forum. We would have never done this 6 or 9 months ago. We've probably even conceived of it. Yet we've all learned how to operate in this environment, to adapt, and that's required innovation through necessity. I think we need to grab the opportunities in front of us of the changing environment. We need to look to becoming more dependent on ourselves rather than overseas markets. We need a shift in our culture to be more ambitious of ourselves. This might seem a bit of a global roundabout way of saying it, but I think you look to Silicon Valley, failure is rewarded. In this country, failure is shunned. We need to be prepared to put ourselves out there, try, fail, get up, go again. And at the other end, in this country, we have this environment of a tall poppy syndrome. Success is chopped down. We need to acknowledge and hold up success to encourage others. And it's like when the tide lifts, all boats should float higher. I think we really need to grab this window and encourage us to take some risks, to look at things differently, and approach this with the opportunity that people will invest if there is opportunity and there's the ability to grow in a country that is a great place and will grow if we invest in it.
Dale, what's your thoughts on what we do next?
Well, humans are funny things. We do what we're told. If we're told to do something, we tend to do it, and we tend to not do anything unless there's something in it for us. So if you translate that into the bigger picture, that means there needs to be a policy setting, so that someone needs to change the policies around, whether that's around decarbonising rail or whatever it might be. There needs to be a policy setting within which somebody might think to do something, and then there needs to be a benefit. So we need to match the benefits for the business, for the rail industry, for the community, to identify the business case for actually getting on and doing something. So I think those two things they're kind of fundamental norms that have to be in place. Has to have the policy setting right. We need to identify the benefits, the needs, the business case for the investment that is needed, and then we need to make sure that does filter down to the academic level, to the next generation coming through school. They have to find a pathway into the research and innovation that's going to underpin all of that. But we're not going to get started unless we have policy settings and some recognition around the benefits of why we are doing this. They're probably the two key things.
Yeah, one of the points you raised actually translates quite well to another issue that is a big one for the ARA, and what we did with the Biz Oxford report in 2018 that also shows we're struggling to get the best and brightest to join the sector. We're struggling to get anyone to join the sector at the moment to meet the needs of the industry over the coming 15 years. So part of that is skilling and upskilling the workforce, and that is sending the message that we are a sustainable sector, that we are one that is focused on innovation and leadership in that space, and that
smart rail for a sustainable and safe Australia.
Absolutely. Michael, what's your thought in terms of your organisation? What would make it more likely for you to be able to be more innovative and in the Australian market?
I think effective innovation needs clear problems to solve with strong commercial motivation, right? So you combine those two things together, and I hate to go back to it, but the miners in the Pilbara did a really good job of that. They had very clear problems they wanted to solve. They communicated them clearly, and they had big programs in place to implement. I think we suffer in the passenger space. I think we suffer from a lack of alignment of priorities from the operators through the supply chain. Collaboration is patchy and often insular. It's not clear to the supply chain what problems operators are trying to solve and what their priorities are and what their plans are. And I'm sure to the operators in reverse, it's not clear what the supply chain can do to help solve their problems. So You know, I think there's, you know, it's the JFK moonshot. You know, we need clear priorities with a, you know, a clear end goal in sight and some commercial motivation and all the stuff that goes around it to make sure we have good access to universities. We have some funding to support short-term activities and those sorts of things. That's what I think we need. Yeah.
Janice, based on your experience with the report, where do you think we should start?
I actually really like what the other panelists have said. I think policy and planning is a really big part of this. Australian governments and railways are just actually dealing with big problems, and they're dealing with growth of congestion and growing cities, and COVID recovery and emissions reduction, and all of those things need to have a culture of permission to optioneer and to bring in different innovative solutions. And so it's both that ability to understand what the problems are and the ability to use innovation and technology, the permission to be able to use those to solve for them.
Thank you for that and for that summation across the issues. I just wanted to move now to one of the chestnuts of the industry, and that's on multiple standards and type approvals. Rob, this is quite the big issue. We might start with you. How do you think that issue is impacting technology adoption, and what do you think we should be doing about it?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think it's a significant challenge. I think, the pursuit of innovation often needs research. It's not the only way, but it's definitely one of the tried and trusted ways. Research, though, needs standards development, and standard developments often need research. I feel they're inextricably linked at that level. To the extent that, the likelihood of the pursuit of innovation being adopted is significantly increased when standards are produced and updated in parallel with that work. To that end, even in the short period of time that I've taken up this role, I've looked to try to, bring upon an unheralded level of cooperation with RISB to try and ensure that at the end of the day, the research that's being delivered has a significantly greater benefit to industry and a significantly greater likelihood of being implemented. However, I don't think it just stops there. I think the holy grail is beyond the development of standards. I think it's type approval that really we need to be turning our attention to. It needs to be part of the research development life cycle. And unfortunately, to do that, it does take time and it's expensive. At the moment, in the budget that I'm working with, it's not something that often our research development life cycle can stretch to be able to cover. Now, I've got great empathy, and I'd like to think some of my friends are those in the industry who are personally responsible for signing off on type approval requests. And that's a significant challenge in our model, is that sometimes this does come down to single individuals having to make these decisions. But I know, Caroline, from our conversation that you're starting at the ARA to look to capture, promote, and indeed harmonise some of the various jurisdictions' type approval processes. That would be a really significant step to streamline the likelihood of innovation being implemented. If we don't, then I believe what we'll do is we'll stop our value add in the pursuit of innovation with a great shelf full of technical reports. But unfortunately, that will be in lieu of actually implementing those ideas out into the field and ultimately improving rail's productivity and safety. So there's much work to be done here, but these are two important elements that beyond the funding and beyond the mechanism, we need to include it within the answer going forward for Australia's innovation future.
I'll now move to some of the questions from the audience. Some of them are not questions. There are many statements. Many of the statements involve commentary around the failures of the Federation. I might just park that as an issue and we'll just accept that as read because we won't be able to change that at this point. One of the issues that's been raised here, obviously we have some fantastic universities doing work. We've mentioned Monash University. Rob, I might pass to you. in terms of the research work that you've been doing, I mean, what do you think are the benefits of engaging with these universities as part of the equation and the solution?
I think it's an important element of the current model, and I think it has to be part of the future model. You know, we have some of the country's brightest and most motivated individuals working within our university sector. The great outcomes that we've delivered to date as a country often can go back to some of the work that the universities have provided. At this particular point in time, we know our university sector is struggling, so it is another call to arms around, you know, taking advantage of COVID to try to kickstart as many elements of our value add chain as we can do. Now, today, in my model, we've worked with a number of universities, including Monash. We've spread the work around, but there's no reason why going forward that couldn't be even larger. If we're talking about, you know, an order of magnitude, perhaps growth in the work that we deliver, there's room for the universities because they provide that independence. They allow us to be able to look at suppliers' work and validate and verify whether what we're being told is true. No disrespect, Michael, but sometimes it's good to have somebody else other than you guys tell us how wonderful you are.
No, it's not.
So I think that's important, isn't it?
Nothing personal.
I would just add to this, Caroline. The RMCRC was really interesting because, to me anyway, because what we saw on that was industry are very interested in the development end, the application and development end of the R&D. And they tend, because it's a shorter cycle to commercialisation and the pot of gold that I talked about earlier. But one of the really good things that the RMCRC did was supported 51 PhDs. And those 51 PhDs were doing more fundamental research up the other end, more longer term research. So I think we do need to think about that as well. We need to focus on the sharper end, the development end and the application end, but I think we need mechanisms to ensure that we're developing within universities capability and expertise for the big R as well.
It might surprise, sorry to interrupt, it might surprise the audience and even those on the panel that the leading institution in energy optimisation in rail transport is right here in Australia. It's the University of South Australia. They've led in the thinking on this for 30 years before it was a thing. And in a way, my company's the beneficiary of that because we've taken a lot of that research and turned it into products. But there's a really good example of a kind of an unsung cleverness. Aussies are clever people, and we lead in so many things that never see the light of day unless there's an appetite or an opportunity to take them to the market. But the University of South Australia is a really good story because of what they have done to lead in I think a really important area of transport.
The questions are coming thick and fast now. Just where to even start? There's some interesting ones in here. Okay, the report findings look excellent, but I notice old chestnuts, including the conservative nature of the industry, and agree that government procurement processes, I'm not going to say what they said next, but take it to be that they're not productive. How do we actively challenge and change these core policy and business structures without it looking like we're cutting corners or on safety or increasing or shifting risk? And this shifting risk issue has come up in a few of the questions. Cam, do you want to start us off on that one?
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult one to answer because where we're at as a result of poor practices, as a result of unfortunate circumstances which have led to not the most desirable outcomes. And equally, government looking to protect itself as best it possibly can in a risk-averse way and shifting risk from the government to through procurement to the provider, the constructor, or the technology solution. That's really challenging in this risk-averse environment that we live in. And I said it earlier, procurement's the absolute death knell to innovation. Somehow we need to be able to release those shackles in order to more transparently, with integrity, be able to give the market the freedom to be able to respond to government's needs that will be encouraging of innovation, encouraging of people taking risk without putting ministers on the front page of papers. And that's a whole question in its own right of how you can do that. I don't have a solution, frankly. I work in that environment every single day. And, you know, I've got probity officers over me. I've got conflict of interest in every direction and turn. Any person I ever know that I've ever said hello to, they end up wanting to talk to me about something and then end up possibly putting forward a bid for something. I've got to fill in, you know, a 9-page form to make sure that I'm not, you know, on the take somewhere else, or even receiving a bottle of wine. Not that I'd do any of those two things. So we've got to a culture where we've buttoned ourselves so down, it's so hard to move. We've got to move away from that. I don't have the solution other than we need to rely on people's integrity, transparency. We've got to put trust back into the relationship between the purchaser and the supplier.
I think
can I add something, Caroline?
Yes, absolutely, Michael.
Yeah, I see the problems, Cam, from our side that the relevant public servants largely go through. But I think one of the big issues is when there's a bid on for a large rolling stock acquisition, for instance, that's the first time anyone ever thinks about it. They tend to, they put a procurement team together, they get a whole lot of consultants and write a specification of requirements, right? And it's too late. It's too late at that point to start thinking about innovation. There needs to be much more engagement and collaboration down through the supply chain much earlier than that. Even doing trials, even doing some modernisation on older trains, rolling stock, that sort of thing. Taking the risk out of the innovation for the major projects, because the major projects sometimes is not the place to experiment because there is a huge amount of risk. So anyway, I think early engagement would with the supply chain would solve a lot of those issues. Not solve them, but help a lot of those issues. Yeah.
I think that's an interesting point, Michael. It's one that hopefully we'll get a presentation on maybe next year at Ausrail. The Victorian government's doing some really interesting things in this space in trying to sort of try new and interesting ways for procurement at the moment, which does involve getting parties involved quite early before the framework comes out. So it will be interesting to see what benefit that provides as a process. I suppose the challenge with Victoria is that obviously they're very focused on what their state has to contribute, which I understand has value to a point, but then also we've obviously got providers around the country who also want to be part of that innovation dialogue, so that can make it a bit challenging. At this point, I'm conscious of the fact that we need to finish up in about 7 minutes. So I might at this point allow everyone to just make some final comments before we wrap up. Rob, can I start with you? Obviously, you're in a unique position with your organisation, and obviously with you coming on board, it's very exciting and reviewing the future and what your organisation will be doing. What are your thoughts on this report and where to from here?
Yeah, I think one of the elements that resonated wasn't so much the technical side of things, but was the culture. And I know we just sort of touched on it a little bit there, but I think it is part of our challenge as a country is, what is the innovation culture that we're after? And, I think some of those sort of statements that we could think about then is, to find a mechanism to encourage the unreasonable, to give people the capacity to think, and as we mentioned before, the freedom to fail. Good research, it's okay to fail. It's how we actually learn from it and move forward that can often, reach that breakthrough. Our relationships within the rail industry, yes, we have challenges working together sometimes, but we also have other industries that we can learn from, trying to take advantage of breakthroughs in other industries and apply it to some of the problems that we've faced for the last 100, 200 years as an opportunity that would allow our culture to improve. The other thing's a bit more sort of tactical. We need to hire the best. When we're pursuing innovation, we need to be willing to get the right people in that space to pursue it. Sharing our learnings, Caroline. We need a model that allows some of these breakthroughs and good ideas to be shared. But probably on top of all of that is innovation in Australia. It needs a home, it needs a presence, and it needs an identity that the industry can be proud of. That's what I'd like to see.
Wonderful. I feel like now I should have ended with you as the final comment, but Dale, what's your thoughts in terms of where to from here?
Yeah, obviously, you mentioned the federation. We have, whatever we do nationally, we have to bring the states along. So there's work to do and how this joins up, and what role states might play in a national structure, whether it be rail academies, centres of excellence distributed across each state. I mean, you mentioned Monash, heavy haul, so you can sort of envisage, a model where, states might have centres of excellence for particular aspects of research with some sort of a national overarching body. So I think that has to be followed through and has to be articulated, and governments need to get behind it. I think the rail CRC model, there have been 3 rail CRCs, to remind folks, is a good one because it, as Mike touched on, I think it is a very good example of how industry and research and government can cooperate, and more importantly, it does bring SMEs. The blood of Australia pretty much contained in SMEs, I would say, and a lot of this, they're the ideas, they're the thinkers. Often has to be industry led, bringing small SMEs together with large tier ones, the Knorr, Bremse, and the large multinationals. Is CRC, I think, has been quite successful in brokering that. So there are some models there, not the only one, but we need to get a model. Then we need to back it with the appropriate policy and the compelling reason to act. What are the problems we're solving? How do we get the funding to support the research? How do we then tear that down into the academic institution, the younger generation? How do we get them excited by what we're doing? So it kind of starts with, I think, getting a clear view around the sort of body that we want, and the ARA being able to articulate that, as you've done very well, I think, articulate that to government, get them on board.
Janice, final comments from you for today.
Thank you. We really look forward to seeing the discussion that this report catalyses and energises, and look forward to seeing how it's received. The final comment would just be that the timing is really right for this. I think the confluence of a few factors makes this a very, very timely issue for the ARA to be putting on the national agenda. And I think we've covered off a few of those, like COVID is really triggering a bit of a reset, a bit of a rethink about supply chains, etc. The CRC closed in June, and so what comes next is a really open question. And I think the investment pipeline, $155 billion of planned projects in a 15-year period, is an extraordinary pipeline. And reform and collaboration is richest when there are projects in the pipeline, and that surely would spur some energy into this discussion.
Wonderful. Michael, final comments from you.
I don't want to repeat what everyone else says, but I think the time is right as well. I think energetic leadership, national leadership, that engenders collaboration from the operators through the supply chain is really important. And I agree with Dale. I think the CRC is a good model, and I think ACRI, in a different way, is a good model as well. I mean, I think they're somewhat complementary. I think they both should exist, and I think it's really important that somehow we get these policy settings, national policy settings, right. And there's so much opportunity at the moment. I think the time is absolutely right.
Yeah. Absolutely. And Cam, the final word from you. What do you see for the future?
I think the opportunity to use this report to shape, mould and influence the policy settings is fundamental. I've got 5 points. I think we need a dedicated effort and energy towards harmonisation of standards. We need to be prepared to look at risk profile and the risks that people are prepared to take. We need to review the procurement model and the process. It may be a generalist statement, but together we will be stronger. And I think that the report shows this. It's been said before, my fifth point, the time is now, and together the time is now to be bold and to make change, not miss this opportunity.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Wonderful. So thank you. That brings us to the end of our launch today. First of all, thank you to Janice, Natasha and LEK. Thank you to all of our panelists. In terms of the final report and the associated fact sheets, they are now available on the ARA website. As I mentioned, we've got a number of research papers coming up soon, so I do encourage you to look out for those. Also a plug for Ausbrail. For the first time, we have a dedicated technology and innovation stream as part of our program, so I do encourage you to look at that. I hope you found today's event informative, and if you've got any questions or any further input, please don't hesitate to email me or give me a call. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon.